I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. John Meade. He is an associate professor of Old Testament studies at Phoenix Seminary. And he is also co-founder and also a co-director of Text and Canon Institute. And he got Ph.D. from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It was sad, actually, because I couldn't see him, actually. This is like our first time we met this is the first time we met virtually, but hopefully our relationship will grow up in the future. And also, he has so many publications. I count maybe almost like 50 publications, and I cannot read one by one. And also, he is also a member of editorial committee of Hexapla Project, Hexapla Institute. And John Mee is married to Annie. And also like Dr. John has 4 children, Karis, Magdalena, Emma, and Peter. And I would like to give an applause to Dr. John Mee. Once again, thank you, Dr. John Mee. Are you here, Dr. John Mee? Is Dr. John Mee here? Okay, Dr. John Mee is here. Once again,
I'm here, Philip.
Okay, thank you, Dr. John Mee. And we will. And now
can you hear me
the
okay?
time
Can you
is.
Hear me okay?
Yeah, okay. We can hear you. Thank you once again for your participation, your willingness, your availability to equip us in Indonesia, far away. And also, like, I know it is already night for you there. And once again, thank you. And we would like to get to know from you more about Text and Canon Institute. And also, we would like to learn from you as in Old Testament textual criticism. You are my senior, and you are, Dr. Peter Gentry says many great things about you, and we are honored to have you here. So the time is yours now.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me. And I must confess, this is the first time I've presented this material like on a Zoom call. So this is a new experience for me. Does the presentation start now or at 7? Or I guess we can just go now.
Yeah, you can go now.
And we'll see how it goes. Okay. Well, Dr. Chia did a great job introducing me there. I can say more about the Text and Canon Institute maybe during the question and answer, okay, Q&A. But I think at the moment, I want to see if I can share a screen, and I've got a presentation that I'll walk us through regarding the text of the Old Testament. And looking at all the different speakers coming your way here over the next 2 days, this will just be, I feel like this will be more of a flyover, a survey, and there'll be some presentations that will go a bit deeper. So let me see here. 1 second, see how this works. Get this into, oh, that's not what I wanted really. Let's see. I think I might have to do it this way. Go share. All right, is that sharing now? And then let's see if it'll go into slideshow mode here. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I can no longer see myself. All I see is the screen, but here we are. Okay, so the text of the Old Testament. And there's many ways we could sort of start this off, but I kind of like to show the different views that maybe are out there. And so when we talk about the text of the Old Testament, there's a whole lot of debate, okay, about what it looks like. Can we retrieve it? Was it reliably copied? Was there even an original text of the Old Testament? So here's a quote. Perhaps it's too provocative, but here we are. by Michael Law, When God Spoke Greek. The quote is, "To be candid, before the Bible, there was no Bible, nor was there any way of knowing how the final version of the individual books would appear." Okay. A little bit later in this same book, he says, "We have seen repeatedly that the Septuagint, and especially the Dead Sea Scrolls, offer proof that the Hebrew Bible was not fixed before the 2nd century CE. And readers before then were not bothered about it." Okay, so we have a couple of key issues here. Number one is, was there a fixed text before the 2nd century AD? And what is the evidence, okay, for a fluid text and for a fixed text? Okay. And the second issue is, were ancient readers and scribes of the Bible bothered by the state of disrepair of their copies? Okay, so I think they actually were. Okay, I remember we're talking about human issues here. Okay, and one of the questions here is, how much has humanity changed? All right, or not? Okay, and here's a quote from a document known as the Letter of Aristeas, or sometimes called the Letter of Pseudo-Aristeas, paragraph 30. This is written around 100 BC, okay? And here's the quote, okay? "The scrolls of the law of the Jews, together with a few others, are missing from the library. For these works are written in Hebrew characters and language, but they have been copied somewhat carelessly." Okay, that's interesting. "And not as they should be, according to the report of the experts, because they have not received royal patronage." Now, I like this quote because it actually shows that in the era before Christ, there actually were Jews who noticed that their Hebrew copies, okay, had been copied somewhat carelessly. Some translations will translate the Greek there as the copies are in disrepair. Okay, they could actually recognize the difference between a good copy and a bad copy, or a copy that was carelessly transcribed, or one that wasn't. And this is, again, well over 2,000 years ago, okay, that we've got this kind of testimony. Okay, so it's quite clear to me ancients did notice and they did care whether their copies were copied well or not. So with that, what's the evidence for the Hebrew text? Okay, we're going to start with our Hebrew manuscripts here. And the Dead Sea Scrolls probably need very little, if any, introduction. Notice the date range I'm applying to these, the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. We'll talk more about the Dead Sea Scrolls as we go. A witness that's talked very little about in these discussions is the Samaritan Pentateuch. And notice I've given a date range of 9th century to 11th century AD. And the reason for that is the manuscripts are dated to that range, okay? What's interesting is the manuscripts are late, but we know the Samaritan Pentateuch came into being quite a bit earlier, okay? We actually know the final kind of dividing point or dividing marker between Jews and Samaritans happened around 110 BC when John Hyrcanus, the Jewish leader at the time in the Maccabean period, rolled up into Samaria and destroyed the shrine there on Mount Gerizim. Okay, not a great way to win friends and influence people, you see, but here we are. And so the Samaritan Pentateuch, and again, we kind of know that some of its distinctives were around or were in the text. That is, the altar that the Israelites first built, according to Deuteronomy 27, was not on Mount Ebal like our Masoretic text has, but was actually on Mount Gerizim, according to the Samaritan Pentateuch. In John chapter 4, when Jesus had to go through Samaria, and he met that Samaritan woman by the well, and he explains that, there's coming a day, right, when Jews and Samaritans, right, will no longer worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem, right? But they're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And the woman basically takes issue with that and says, well, no, we Samaritans say that we worship on Mount Gerizim. And she's pointing right to the Samaritan Pentateuch for the evidence for her viewpoint. The Masoretic text is the dominant Hebrew strand. Okay, this represents, well, I don't know, many thousands of manuscripts. We'll come back to that issue a little bit later in the presentation. But again, the manuscripts are all dated to somewhere between the 9th and 11th century, or 9th to 15th century AD. In many ways, this presentation is about how old and how reliable is the Masoretic text tradition. So we have Hebrew manuscripts, and we have them in droves. Okay, we have like thousands of them, and we'll talk about that issue here in a moment. Another piece of evidence that Old Testament or Hebrew Bible textual critics make use of are the ancient Greek versions. Here, of course, we have in mind the Greek Septuagint. Okay, and here again, I've dated the tradition, 3rd century BC to the 1st century BC. It's probably when all of the books of the Hebrew canon were first translated into Greek. Okay. And again, this is a caption from the Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century AD, okay? But quite clearly, this is a Christian copy of books that were translated into Greek centuries beforehand. As often happens with translations, later readers of these translations become dissatisfied with the older translations, okay? And again, this happens in modern day. I'd like to hear from you all how much it happens in Indonesia, but it definitely happens where I'm from. And but there's nothing new under the sun, okay? And it's very clear that as soon as these earliest Greek translations were carried out, they immediately began to be revised. Jews started to revise them, whether it was just because they wanted to keep the language up to date, whether it was because they wanted proper interpretation and exegesis of the text represented in their translations. We can't know for sure, or whether it was simply they wanted to make sure that the translation was based on the most accurate Hebrew copies. Okay, they don't give us all the reasons, but what we do know is that many Jews started to revise these so-called Greek Septuagint translations, and there became 3 very famous ones named Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. And these are usually dated to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And so prominent were these translations or revisions, okay, that the church father of Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, he included these 3 different Jewish translations along with the Septuagint and the Hebrew text and a transcription of the Hebrew in Greek letters in his so-called hexapla, or his 6-columned Bible, okay, of the Old Testament. This is actually a snapshot here of a manuscript known as Ralph's 86. This is dated to the 9th century or the 10th century AD. I don't know if you can see this. Hopefully you can. It is headed with the Greek term ektone hexaplone. This is actually out of the hexapla. And what the scribe has done here is he's given us the verse of Hosea 11, verse 1, right? That very famous verse that contains the words, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And down here, the scribe is actually very interested in which version Matthew, the gospel according to Matthew, quoted. Okay, did he quote the Hebrew, or did Matthew give a translation of the Hebrew? Or perhaps Matthew had somehow access to Aquila or Symmachus's or the Septuagint or Theodotion. But in this case, the scribe gives you 5 out of the 6 columns of the hexapla, you see, which is incredible. And again, this is probably too small to see on the screen, but this is actually Hebrew words in Greek letters. This is the actual transcription of the Hebrew text of Hosea 11, verse 1. By the way, we know that Matthew does not quote the Septuagint of Hosea 11:1 because we are told instantly from the hexapla that the Greek text is metakalasa, I summoned ta tekna autu. I summoned his children, which of course is not what Matthew quotes, where he quotes something like, I called my son. And what's interesting is all these other Jewish revisions, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, have some variation of the language of my son, which goes all the way back to the Hebrew text, you see. So Matthew probably makes his own translation, but that's a question for another day. But these ancient Greek versions are absolutely critical to biblical studies, okay? They're absolutely critical to not only textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, but also the exegesis, and particularly early Jewish exegesis of the Hebrew scriptures in Greek translation. There are some other ancient versions that we won't be able to talk too much about here, but we've got the Latin Vulgate from Jerome, who worked in the very latter part of the 4th century and early part of the 5th century AD, working on a Latin translation, a brand new Latin translation from the Hebrew text. Now, there was an already existing Latin translation, something known as the Vetus Latina. And the old Latin translation was from the Greek Septuagint. Jerome created something known as the Yuxta Hebraeus, or the Yuxta Hebraeum, according to the Hebrew, you see. In fact, the name Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, as a title for this translation, didn't really surface till about the 16th century AD, right? So the very kind of latter part of the Renaissance and early part of the Reformation. But until then, it was known exclusively as the Yuxta Hebraeus, or the Latin version according to the Hebrew, as over and against the Latin version according to the Septuagint, you see. So the Latin Vulgate is a very important text for textual criticism of the Old Testament. And a version we'll say even less about is the Syriac Peshitta from the 2nd, 3rd century AD. Again, in Edessa, Syria, it seems that there were some Christians who perhaps converted out of Judaism, living there in Edessa, Syria, and they made a brand new Syriac translation from the Hebrew scriptures there. The earliest complete manuscript of this goes to something like 600 AD, or somewhere in the 7th century, okay? And so very, very important witness, again, to the Hebrew Bible. Just to give you an idea of how important Jerome's Latin Vulgate was, I want to show you something. And I don't know, this is Michelangelo's Moses. Okay, this is his famous sculpture. And I don't know if you've ever noticed the 2 horns on the top of Moses's head here. Everyone familiar with this? Yeah? Some of you are like, oh man, I can't unsee that now. So, and so anyhow, we've got Moses represented with horns. And I was curious one day, how did this happen? Well, a common English translation of this, of Exodus 34:29, would read something like, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone, okay? And the Vulgate, though, has something like, and he was ignorant that his face was horned, hornuta esset facie sua. And here, it's quite clear that Jerome had read the same Hebrew verb karan, but he read it in a very literal way, or an etymological way, from the Hebrew noun keren, meaning horn. And so the Vulgate had Moses sprouting horns on his face or his head. And that verse has influenced many, many, many representations of Moses in medieval art and sculpture, you see. So I like to say that Bible translation has massive consequences, you see. So anyhow. All right, so that is a quick survey of the ancient versions, okay, that are in play. We could talk about the Aramaic Targum as well, but I've left that out for the sake of time. Now, how about important Hebrew manuscripts from the 3rd, 8th century AD? Notice there are very few listed here. There's probably a good handful more that I could have included, but they couldn't all fit on the slide. There are more early copies or parts of copies of a late medieval Hebrew Torah scroll. Okay, some 10 fragments have now been shown to belong to the same manuscript, even though they're divided up. Some of these fragments are in Cambridge, some of these fragments are in Duke's library, which is fascinating. So anyways, they're all over the world, but scholars have been able to piece 10 or so fragments together, showing that they are all part and parcel of the same Hebrew Torah scroll. So we could add probably a good 8 or 9 more texts to this. But this is sometimes called the silent period, okay? There are very few Hebrew manuscripts from the 3rd to 8th century AD. Scholars speculate about that as to why we have so few copies, but the fact is we do not have many copies from this period. Here's a list of important Hebrew manuscripts that date to just before 1100 AD. Okay, we'll talk quite a bit about the Leningrad Codex, the Aleppo Codex. These are the two most important, I would say. Just to give you an idea, as to the value of these, Sassoon 1053, dated to the 10th century AD, contains most of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Here's a good picture of it. And just a year or two ago, this codex sold for about $38.1 million at Sotheby's auction. Okay, so pretty fascinating there. And but this is a complete Hebrew Bible, very, very important text that again sold for almost 40 million bucks. Here's a leaf just out of the Leningrad Codex. Again, the colophon or the final note in the Leningrad Codex dates this manuscript precisely to 1008 AD. And again, this is just Psalms 81 to 84 here. Here's the same text range in the Aleppo Codex, again, dated about a century earlier to about 925, 930 AD. So that just kind of gives us a really good survey, okay, of all of the witnesses that go into thinking about and reconstructing the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. But with that, now I want to go into what is the earliest evidence for the Hebrew text, okay? I get this question a lot. And let's start with the indirect evidence for the Hebrew text. Here is a silver amulet from Hetef Hinnom. And the text reads, "May he or she be blessed by Yahweh, the warrior, and the rebuker of evil. May Yahweh bless you, keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and grant you peace." Now, again, most of us would probably recognize that as a text pulled from Numbers 6, 24 to 26. The silver amulet here is dated to the 7th or 6th century BC. Okay, now this is the earliest evidence for a text remotely biblical. Okay, but as you can see here, right, this is no manuscript, right? Like this is a piece of silver. It's a piece of jewelry that one might wear around their neck, you know, to carry the Aaronic blessing around with them, you see. And so this is not a manuscript, of course, but it is still the earliest textual evidence for anything in the Bible. Okay, and it just happens to come from number 6 and Aaron's blessing upon the people. So the fact of the matter is we don't have any other textual evidence of the Hebrew Bible until we hit the 3rd century BC with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But still, scholars still speculate, though, about what ancient Israel might have done, okay? And here we start with, and again, I could have chosen any number of ancient texts, okay? I chose something from the Hittites, but we could have chosen texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Hittites. No question that the ancient temple or the ancient shrine played a massive role in the curating of a nation's documents or a nation's texts. Okay, so here's the kind of the colophon or the deposition clause of a Hittite treaty from around 1300 BC. This treaty tablet has already been made, and it shall be placed in Arena in the presence of the sun goddess of Arena. Okay, again, it's very simple, it's very basic. It's talking about this treaty, this document being placed in the shrine, and the text we can date to about 1300 BC. I could show you numerous Hittite treaties that have these deposition clauses showing the same thing. There are texts in Egypt, from Assyria, from Babylon, that all show a very similar pattern. So that's why but I bring these up to show that there are references to these so-called temple texts in the Hebrew Bible itself, right? So in Deuteronomy 31, 24 to 26, when Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant, which of course was located in the shrine, right? In the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle, right? And then eventually in the Holy of Holies, or the Devir of the temple itself. The same thing appears in 2 Kings 22, verse 8. And Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. So you can kind of see, right? Like it's clear, I think, that what we call the biblical texts, these scrolls, were preserved in the ancient tabernacle and eventually the ancient temple, okay? And so consistent was this that even down to the Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century AD, as he's recounting the tale of the Romans coming in and destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple, he has this to say. He says, the spoils in general were borne in promiscuous heaps, but conspicuous above all stood those captured in the temple at Jerusalem. And he goes on and he gives a list of things that he took. But then he says, after these, and last of all the spoils, was carried a copy of the law of the Jews, you see. So from the very beginning, right, in Deuteronomy, we get this deposition clause of the law being stored in the temple to the very end of Israel's history in the land, right? Josephus recounts that the law of the Jews, a copy of that law, was in the temple, and the Romans carried it off. So this, again, is not a smoking gun, right, for the direct preservation of the Hebrew Bible, right? These are just some indirect pieces of evidence, I think, that go a long way to showing how we have a text of the Hebrew Bible at all. But with that, let's then turn to the direct evidence, okay, for the Hebrew text. And here we're looking at Qumran and beyond, right? So a little bit of a map here, just to kind of show, here's the Dead Sea, Jerusalem and Jericho, right? Qumran gets all the press, right? Very, very well-known, popular spot. But there are other spots along the Dead Sea known as Wadi Mirabaat, Wadi Sedir, the Nachal Hever, right? The Cave of Horrors, Nachal Se'alim, and then, of course, the fortress at Masada. Okay, so what do all these sites tell us about the history of the Old Testament? Well, archaeologists were able to discover some 20 biblical scrolls from other sites. That is, sites not Qumran. Okay, so from all these sites here, we've got some 20 biblical scrolls. Okay, what's important to know that, remember we talked about that Masoretic text just a moment ago. Okay. And all of them preserve the textual or the consonantal text of the Masoretic text. This is something scholars call the Proto-Masoretic text, you see. And that's fascinating. And I'm going to come back and show you a clear example of this that was discovered at Masada a little bit later. But if we look at just Qumran, we will know scholars, archaeologists have discovered some 210 biblical scrolls from Qumran. But what's important to know is that these scrolls are of a mixed character, okay? Whereas the scrolls from the other sites all reflect the Proto-Masoretic text, the scrolls from Qumran sometimes reflect the Proto-Masoretic text, sometimes they reflect maybe the Hebrew text of the Septuagint, or sometimes they reflect the Samaritan Pentateuch. At other times, they do reflect what we might call free copying. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of that as well here. So a summary of this is that the non-Qumran texts were copied conservatively and always matched the Proto-Masoretic text. The Qumran texts were copied not as conservatively, and oftentimes they were copied freely. And again, I'm going to come back and give an example of that here in a moment. There were later Greek translations and revisions that I mentioned earlier of the Septuagint. Almost all of these, if not all of these, later Greek translations and revisions reflect a conservatively copied Hebrew text, as well as a pretty literal translation approach to the Hebrew Bible. Here is the excavated fortress at Masada, okay? And there were manuscripts such as a Psalms scroll, preserving Psalms 81 to 85, discovered in the synagogue here right off the corner here. And there were a few other texts discovered there as well. I'll come back and talk about this one in a moment. The caves at Qumran, of course, yielding the Dead Sea Scrolls. When we'll say more about that in a moment as well. Here's an example of a Greek text, okay, that was discovered at Nachal Hever, okay? So we tend to think of Dead Sea Scrolls as always being Hebrew or Aramaic, but here are some very clear fragments of Greek texts, okay, of the 12 minor prophets discovered at Nachal Hever. And just to kind of illustrate how conservative the translator was here, what's interesting is, I don't know if you can see this, but you've actually got the Tetragrammaton, okay? Yod, Hey, Wow, Hey, Yahweh, okay? In Proto-Hebrew letters written into an otherwise Greek translation of the Hebrew, right? Which, of course, I think signals the very conservative nature of this text. We can speculate further as to whether they were pronouncing the divine name or not, but we'd be speculating at best, okay? Now, what about the Masoretic text itself? Okay, let's talk about this. How many manuscripts are there? How many manuscripts are there? Well, there's no certain figure, okay? But many of you have probably heard that something like the Greek New Testament is the most well-preserved document from the ancient world, right? Scholars date just over maybe enumerate something like just over 5,000 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. No doubt that's a large figure. But what's fascinating is when you start talking about something like the Hebrew Bible, we now know that there are 24,000 biblical fragments from the old synagogue in Cairo. Okay, I mean that's a massive amount of data and material. Again, all of these fragments would date from like the from the 8th century AD kind of on up. Okay, but some 24,000 biblical texts from Cairo. Again, more good work being done on this. There's some 11,000 records of manuscripts and remains in the National Library of Israel. Okay, so I'm not a math major, but that's some 35,000 manuscripts and fragmentary remains from the 15th century and earlier when we're talking about the Hebrew Masoretic text. Okay, that is truly what we're going to call an embarrassment of riches. Okay, that's a massive amount. Scholars have not waded through all of this yet. There's still a ton more work to do on these texts, but it's important to kind of know that they exist, okay, before we can sort of dedicate some research efforts to them. Now, what about the copying quality? Okay, this is always a question. And here, scholars like to talk about conservative copying, or sometimes they might use the term repetition. Okay, this is when a scribe clearly has it in his mind that he is going to copy his exemplar, right, letter for letter, word for word. Okay, even line for line, right? Every line in his copy must match the exemplar, okay? Every line must begin with the same word and end with the same word. You see what I mean? Like very, very exact copying. Repetition is a great word. But no doubt some of our manuscripts show a freer copying, okay? Or sometimes known as a resignified copy, okay? I'll explain that a bit later. Now, a question that, again, gets asked and sometimes just glossed over in the literature, but did the scribes care about quality control? Well, I'm going to argue that they did. Here we are in the Leningrad Codex of Isaiah 47-8, okay? We've got the text here, Yavesh Katsir Navel Tzitz, right? The flower falls, the grass withers and the flower falls. This occurred, of course, earlier in the verse. Yavesh Katsir Navel Tzitz, okay? And this text is copied correctly. Here's what it looks like, okay? We've got Isaiah 47-8, okay? Here it is in English translation. We've got the Hebrew text out here. Some of you can guess where this is going because we have 4 identical words here, only separated, right, by a line or two, right, in the Hebrew manuscript. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we don't have to guess or speculate because in a copy of Isaiah, known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, dated to, say, 150 to 100 BC, the experiment actually plays out, okay? Because here we are. We've got the Yavesh Chatzir Navel Tzitz, this line right here, right? The grass withers and the flower falls. And then instead of for the breath of Yahweh breathes on it, right? And for all flesh is like grass, we go right in to the text about the word of our God, Yakum Le'olam. So the word of our God remains or stands forever, which is the way verse 8 ends, you see. So what happened? Well, it's obvious what happened. The scribe's eye up here skipped from that first instance of Yavesh Chatzir Navel Tzitz all the way down to the second instance in verse 8. And all of verse 7 in the Great Isaiah Scroll was initially skipped. Okay? Now, here's a question. If the scribes don't care about quality, if the reader and the user of the manuscript don't care about quality, then you might just keep going, right? But that's not what happens here at all. In fact, the missing verse is added here between the lines and all the way down the margin, you see. Okay? So in my thinking, scribes do care about quality control. They do make mistakes, okay? But in this case, the scribe or a later corrector caught it, and the additional text is added word for word between the lines and then down the margin, okay? All of this happening around 150 BC. So, very interesting. So they do care about quality control. I think that's obvious. I could show numerous examples in this manuscript where that happens. Now, of course, they don't catch all the mistakes that they make. But here is a great example where a big mistake was committed and they actually caught it and corrected it. Now, when we talk about conservative copying, let's look at Exodus 14 and 15 here together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you two kind of manuscripts side by side. And just kind of as a global statement here, okay, textual information on these two manuscripts, there's hardly any spelling or other copyist mistakes between the text I'm about to show you. In fact, the layout and poetic line divisions in between these manuscripts is preserved. And we'll make some summary conclusions. Here we're talking about the Ashkar-Gilson text, which is actually housed in the Rubenstein Library at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And last year I had the wonderful privilege and opportunity to go and actually see this manuscript. I don't know if you can see my hand here, but look how massive this is. And this is almost the entire top margin and bottom margin preserved. Here's the same text, but in a negative image. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a little bit clearer now. But look how complete the bottom margin is here. And the top margin is mostly preserved as well. And then you got these massive columns of text, don't you, as preserved here. In fact, this is kind of the end. Well, it starts, this is some Exodus 13 and 14. And then this is Moses' song by the sea in Exodus 15. But can everybody see, right? You have these narrow columns. And then when you hit this column here in the scroll, it widens out a little bit. And then, of course, you have 5 lines here. I'll talk more about those in a minute. You've got a space. And then you've got this elaborate layout here, don't you? For the poem of Moses' song by the sea. Okay? And then after that poem's done, you get a space, and then the text kind of continues on. Okay? But again, this is a scroll. This is not a codex. Here's the same text, but now fast forward a few hundred years. And this is the end of Exodus 14, okay, in these narrow columns. And the very next page is that same elaborate layout. You see the 5 special lines, the space, and then Exodus 15, Moses' song by the sea, presented here quite intricately and elegantly and elaborately. Here are the 2 images kind of side by side. It's really important to understand, right, that at this point of copying, every single line must begin and end with the same words, which they actually do. What's fascinating is the earlier scribe seems to have this down. Once the Jewish scribe started to work in a codex format, it's fast. I think it threw off the approach. Does everyone see these little dots here? They're like little fillers, okay? Just to ensure that the scribes will begin and end each line as his exemplar has, okay? And notice how even this line here ends a bit early, so he adds in more filler dots, you see, so that Exodus 15 will begin where it should begin. So when I talk about conservative copying, this is a great example. And we're talking about a period of 300 to 400 years between this Torah scroll here and the Codex Leningrad here, okay? This is, I mean, we're just throwing out numbers here, right? But you have to imagine how long a period is 300 to 400 years to have exact copying, okay, from the Proto-Masoretic to the Masoretic period. Again, we can point out more differences here. Notice that there are no vowels here yet, right? But this text is filled with vowel points and dashes, okay? And of course, again, the big difference is this is a scroll, whereas this is a codex, okay? So there were massive differences happening, even in technological use, you see, by these Jewish scribes over this some 400-year period. Now, this is a great example, but how far back can we push the conservative copying? Okay, well, I want to show you an example, again, of conservative copying from Psalm 82. And again, the examples I'm going to show you, again, there are hardly any spelling or other copyist mistakes. We're going to talk a little bit about the layout and poetic line divisions, and then we'll have some summary conclusions. But I'm coming back here to Psalm 82 in what's known as the Masada Psalms scroll, okay? And I'm just, again, for the sake of time, we're going to focus on Psalm 82. This is the Mizmor LaAsaph, okay, a psalm of Asaph. And just some things to notice here. Notice how verse 1 would begin here, okay? And there's a space. And verse 1 continues on the second column. But this is actually one verse made up of 2 Hebrew lines of poetry, okay? In fact, it's quite clear to me that the space represents for the reader when he is to pause. And then he begins the next line, and at the end of the line, he will pause again. And then he will pick up the next line, okay, and continue on. But the system of spaces is crucial to the dividing up of each verse, so to speak, into various poetic lines. Okay? Now, this is, again, note the date on this. This is sometime probably between 30 BC or sometimes 50 BC, depending on which scholar you read. This is quite early to something like maybe 15 AD. Okay, this is the date range given to these things. Here's Psalm 82 in the Aleppo Codex. Again, we looked at this earlier, and this is from 925 AD. And again, here's our Mizmor LaAsaph, the Psalm of Asaph. And you'll notice, right, that the scribe even tries to preserve some of these spaces that we saw earlier, right, from the manuscript 1,000 years earlier, okay? And you'll see the spaces here and here and here. But what's fascinating is clearly, right, not every verse has a space, okay? And so Dr. Gentry and I have done some research on the Masada Psalm scroll. Our conclusion is that the relationship of the Masada Psalm scroll to the Aleppo Codex is one of very accurate textual copying. And the spaces in Aleppo simply represent an earlier scribal technique, right, of dividing a verse into its two lines. Okay, it's A line and it's B line. But in time, the Masoretes developed a system of accents, okay, that performed the same function as the earlier space and end of line. They actually developed what's called the Athnok accent here, which signals to the reader when he is to pause. And they developed the Saluk accent, like down here, this little vertical dash here, to develop the final pause of a verse, you see. So what I wanted to know is how well does the system of spaces in the earlier manuscript and end of line correspond to the various pausal and what are known as disjunctive accents in the Masoretic text? Well, pretty well, as it turns out. Here's the first space, and here's the first disjunctive accent. Okay, here's the first end of line. I expect that the end of line will correspond with the Saluk accent here, and that's actually what we get, okay? And we can see this kind of all the way down, okay, all the way through this psalm. So what I'm trying to point out here is that conservative copying is not simply letter for letter, so that would be enough, but what we actually have is the reading tradition over about a 950 to 1,000 year period preserved, you see, from the Masada Psalm scroll down to this Aleppo Codex. Unbelievable conservatism in copying. There is an intermediate step I could show you using Codex Sinaiticus, the Greek translation. This is, again, Psalm 82, but I'm going to skip this for now. We can talk about it later if you want. I need to give you an example of some free copying, okay? So we just talked about conservative copying, letter for letter. I mean, sense unit divisions, right? How to read the Psalms, okay? Preserved over 1,000 years of copying. But some Jewish scribes did not copy everything conservatively, okay? And I'm going to argue that the motive for the scribes is faithfulness, okay? Whether they're copying in a mode of conservatism or they're copying in a mode of freedom, okay? There's going to be a motive of faithfulness. But this text is known as 4Q Deuteronomy N. It is what is known as an excerpted scroll. It actually begins with a stretch of text of Deuteronomy 8, okay? And then immediately coming after that is Deuteronomy 5. Okay, so already, right, chapters like we know them are out of order. okay, when we're looking at 4Q Deuteronomy N. It is quite an odd specimen. And I should say this, the things I'm about to point out are not to be found in any other scroll. This is a one-off. This is a unique text, okay? And or what we might call an unproductive text. It simply is a one-off, okay? But most of our copies of Deuteronomy 5:15 don't read this way. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And then we get this excerption from Exodus 20, verse 11, to sanctify it. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day to sanctify it. And then verse 16 picks up with the next command, honor your father and your mother. Here's what this looks like in the scroll itself, okay? 4Q Deuteronomy N. What we have here is Deuteronomy 5, okay? And Deuteronomy 5. And again, right here in the middle, we get that longer explanation for why the Israelites are to keep the Sabbath day. And it's pretty much word for word Exodus 20, verse 11. Now, I don't know about you, but I would not call this a conservative copy of the Ten Commandments. I just wouldn't. I would never think that Exodus 20, verse 11, with all of its words, all of its text being added between verses here in Deuteronomy 5 would qualify as a conservative copy. Now, what's fascinating here, and I think you need to catch this, is that in the Hebrew, the addition is bracketed by a repeated term, lakadsho, to sanctify it. Okay? And it turns out, this is quite an old scribal technique by which the scribe can bracket added text with the same term, indicating to the reader and the user that this text came from earlier in the work. Okay, and in this case, from the book of Exodus. Okay, not the book of Deuteronomy, but the book of Exodus. And so what I like to point out here is that this addition, although it seems quite radical and chaotic to us, it's not. The scribe is actually measured in the addition. The scribe is doing this on purpose. And I think the reason is that this is a very early attempt to harmonize the different reasons for keeping the Sabbath day command between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And the scribe here has tipped his hand. He's telling us that he's added earlier text from an earlier book. And the reason, we're left to guess the reason, but it makes sense in this case that he's now stacking the two different reasons for keeping the Sabbath day in his copy of the Ten Commandments. So what's going on? Well, overall, 4Q Deuteronomy N, that scroll we just looked at, is a close copy of the Proto-Masoretic text, okay? But the scribe has added Exodus 20, verse 11 between Deuteronomy 5:15 and 16, and he's made some other harmonizations and excerptions along the way. So was the scribe making a new text? Like sometimes this is put in terms of maybe he created a competing text, a text that would compete with the conservatively copied text. Or was the scribe simply providing a liturgical or an interpretive text, right? So remember, the commentary genre or the commentary form is developing, right? It's brand new in some ways. Before the commentary, you had what's called rewritten Bible or these expansive and interpretive copies of the text. You can kind of see, I want to go back and show you real quick. There's not a lot of margin to work with here, is there? And they're not going to add a lot of text to the top and the bottom because they know those are the first parts to be destroyed. In these days, you don't add the parallel passages in the margin. You couldn't really fit them in there very well. The technology wasn't quite developed to add these parallel passages. So you simply added them in the body of the text, But if you were a good scribe, you were careful to bracket them off with a resumptive repetition, like in this case, Lecad's show. So it seems to me that 4Q Deuteronomy N would be not so much a biblical text or a new biblical text to compete with an older one or something like that, but rather this text is a primitive example of a text prepared for liturgy or commentary, you see. So again, we've kind of covered some massive concepts here, but there are two complementary approaches to the copying of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, we can call them conservative and free. Neither textual chaos nor randomness, but rather care for the text is expressed in both modes. In fact, faithfulness is, I think, at the root, okay, or it's the primary motivation for both kinds of text being created. There were simply text created or copied word for word, but maybe some Jews couldn't understand a conservatively copied text. Maybe they needed an updated text, you see. Certainly interpretive texts would be appreciated. And so what's fascinating is the Jewish scribes doing this kind of genius work were also able to keep distinct the copies that they knew they were copying conservatively, and then those copies they knew they were copying a bit more freely. Sorry, excuse my own context here, but the English Bible is based mainly on the Masoretic text. I don't know about the Indonesian Bibles. I'd be interested to hear more about that. Now, this is some new evidence here, or new research, I should say, that I'm starting to engage. So I'm going to share this with you. Right now, there are two main editions of the Hebrew Bible. There are others well under development, and we could talk more about those later. But if you're learning Hebrew, you have probably bought or you own a BHS, a Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia copy. And then the next generation, so to speak, of the BHS is something that is called the Biblia Hebraica Quinta, okay, the BHQ. And the Job volume was just published in 2024. Okay, it is the most recent volume and edition of the BHQ project. Now, I was interested, and again, this is fresh research. You can question me about this, but I've got some, I want to do more work along these lines. But here's BHS Job, okay? The date on this would be like 1977. Its fifth printing was 1997, okay? But this is basically a text from 1977. I had some folks help me out with this. There's about 8,343 Hebrew words in Job, okay? So that's a pretty good number. In the BHS, there is an abbreviation L in the apparatus that stands for lege or legendum, okay, which means read or should be read. I counted some 14 instances of L in the BHS apparatus of Job. Okay, that means that the editor of BHS is basically saying that we should not read with the Masoretic text 0.2% of the time. That's not a lot. Okay, that is a very, very small number. Okay, now if you know anything about the BHS apparatus, there's far more abbreviations to learn. Okay, they have this PRB, stands for probilator. Okay, 11 times they give a text in the apparatus with PRB. That is a text that doesn't read with the Masoretic text that they print at the top. Okay, but that's only 0.1% of the text. They have another abbreviation, FRT, or Fortassa, and this means perhaps, so they're less certain about this one. They use the abbreviation 32 times, or some 0.4% of the text. Now, the most mystifying category in the BHS apparatus has got to be this PRP, which stands for as proposed. This is the equivalent of a conjectural emendation, where the BHS editor says we read with no other documents. We're going to read with the scholarly guess, okay, that's in the apparatus. 92 times I counted PRP in the BHS of Job. That's some 1.1% of the text. Now, what I did was I counted up the PRB, the FRT, and the PRP. And if you put all those numbers together against the 8,343 Hebrew words in Codex Leningrad, or the BHS text, that's still only 1.6% of the text of Job that's uncertain in BHS. This does not show textual fluidity, people. This does not show a fluid text at all. This is the most liberal number I could come up with, okay? But now I want to contrast it with the BHQ Job, okay? This year published, okay, 2024. And again, there's 8,343 Hebrew words. Now, they use a different abbreviation scheme. They use this abbreviation of PREF, okay? And 19 places in the apparatus of BHQ Job, the editor preferred a text different than that of the printed text in the Masoretic text, okay? Only 0.2% then. Okay, this is not a big number. What's more astonishing is that in the apparatus of BHQ, I could only find 2 places where they use the abbreviation conject for a scholarly conjecture. So that is 0.02% of the text they want to conjecture. And that means only 0.02% of Job, of the Job text, is uncertain in the Biblia Hebraica Quinta. So what again, this is kind of a new avenue of research here. What I'm thinking is that over time, editors seem to be becoming more certain, not less certain, more certain of the wording of the text of Scripture. Okay. Now this is only Job. I want some students of mine to do some research in other editions of the Hebrew Bible to see if the same trends kind of continue. I think I have time. Dr. Chia, do I have time to give a couple examples of TC?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. I don't want to run over for you guys, but let's look at a couple examples. How do we do textual criticism? And this is a bit of a funny example. How tall was Goliath? Okay. So this is obviously from First Samuel, chapter 17. And right, depending on which witnesses you read, you would arrive at a Hebrew text that has Goliath at 6 cubits and a span, right, which we estimate is something like 9 feet, 9 inches. And the Masoretic text, those Jewish revisers I was telling you about, Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, the Aramaic Targum, Jonathan, the Syriac Peshitta, and the Vulgate all have Goliath at a height of 6 cubits and a span. Well, that's not the whole story. Because a very important Dead Sea Scroll, 4Q51 or 4Q Samuel A, very prominent witnesses to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, right, the Septuagint, and then that Jewish historian Josephus in his Antiquities, all have Goliath at 4 cubits and a span. or 6 feet 9 inches tall. Okay. So I joke, is he a giant or is he slightly shorter than the NBA phenom Shaquille O'Neal, right? Like, what are we to think about this? Well, textual critics immediately start to see or ask, is there an accidental error in play? Okay. So some scholars suggest this before they reject it, but at least they suggest maybe a scribe copying verse 4, right? 400, wrote 6 cubits, shesh amoth, anticipating the 600 shekels of iron of Goliath's spear in verse 7. In other words, maybe the text was originally 400, but an I skip down to verse 7 shows the secondary change from 4 to 6. Okay. It's possible, but most scholars, and I agree, say that that's a long I skip. Okay. This might be too many lines for the scribe for the scribe's eye to skip all the way down so that he writes 6 instead of 4. Okay, so it's a little bit too difficult to determine the source of this error in some kind of an accident. So this then kind of raises the question, maybe this variant occurs due to some intentional interpretation. And think about it. If you had 4 cubits, right, a shorter Goliath as original, maybe a scribe changes the 4 to 6 to make David's victory seem more impressive, right? It's possible. But 4 is more realistic and provides a critique of Saul, who was head and shoulders taller than his people, we're told, earlier in the narrative in 1 Samuel 9:2. So what you could have is a very tall Goliath that a scribe then makes shorter, okay? So that Saul's cowardice is underscored now, you see. The other issue, and it's not on the slide, but the other issue to consider is that Goliath's height is only mentioned one time in 1 Samuel 17. But what is kind of repeated throughout the narrative is that Goliath is a very skilled warrior in hand-to-hand, one-on-one combat. Okay? And so what could be happening here is that originally Goliath is shorter. Okay? He's 4 cubits and a span. And the reason why Saul and the Israelites are scared to go out and fight him is not because he's some big, huge giant. Though he could be, again, like even 4 cubits in a span is still pretty tall. But anyhow, the main point would be they're afraid of Goliath's abilities on the battlefield in one-on-one combat, right? And, when your resume is you're the one who always walks off the battlefield alive and everyone else you have fought is dead, right? This tends to put fear in your heart. So what I like to say about a textual variant like this one that's very difficult to solve, there's no theology on the line here, is there? At no point does this variant affect my knowledge of God, let's say. But what I do come back and say immediately is no doubt this textual variant will change the way you read the story. Okay? Because Goliath at 9 feet 9 inches versus Goliath at 6 feet 9 inches does influence the way you read the story. So it can affect the narrative, but it's not going to affect the way our theology is done. I think I have time for one more, and then I will close this out. Isaiah 53:11. Okay? And here I'm looking at the little word or, where he will see light and be satisfied. This is in the great Isaiah scroll. The textual variant is between whether the word light is to be read as the original text, or the original text simply omitted the word light, he will see. Those witnesses that don't have the word light are the Masoretic text, the Jewish revisers, Targum, Jonathan, Peshitta, and Vulgate. Those texts that have the word light are 3 different Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint translation. All 4 of those witnesses have the word for light. Now, what do we make of this? I take it that there's an accidental error here, okay? Independent textual traditions, 3 different Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint all contain the word light. I could show you that the scribe's eye skipped from word to word because in the script of the period, it's quite easy to demonstrate that the little tiny word or for Hebrew word or for light simply gets skipped over. Therefore, I think the text should read, on account of the labor of his life, he, the servant, will see light and be satisfied. Now, again, I want to be clear. This reading doesn't influence our theology of the resurrection directly, does it? I mean, the New Testament has much to say about the resurrection of the Messiah. Even places like Psalm 16, right? And maybe even Ezekiel 37, and even the very foundation, right? In Hannah's song and in Moses' song, God kills and he makes alive, right? Like the doctrine of the resurrection is ultimately rooted in numerous other places in Scripture. So I don't think that whether the word light is to be read there or not influences the whole doctrine of the resurrection. But I will say that this text with the word light does make much more clearly, or makes the connection more clearly, that when the servant suffers vicariously for his people, he is vindicated by seeing light and being satisfied. Again, the image of someone seeing light after they've died means that they are coming back from Sheol. They're coming back from the realm of the dead. Something that, like in Job 7, the sages say one who goes down to Sheol never comes back up, you see. They don't see light. But when the servant here is said or predicted to see light and be satisfied, what this is saying is that because he died vicariously, he suffered vicariously for his people, he will be vindicated as the innocent sufferer, and he will be resurrected from the dead by seeing light, by coming back from Sheol or the realm of the dead. Well, just a basic conclusion here. Despite important variants that we've looked at that need more study, research shows a very reliable transmission history of the Hebrew Bible. And I hope the rest of this conference continues to bear that out. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Johnny, once again for your wonderful presentations. And then while we are preparing for Q&A questions, we're going to take some questions from the audience. I would like to start about Text and Canon Institute. Maybe can you explain and you can elaborate what is Text and Canon Institute?
Yeah, great question. So the Text and Canon Institute started in 2019 at Phoenix Seminary, where I teach in Phoenix, Arizona. And it's very unusual for seminaries to have one textual critic, let alone 2 textual critics, both in the area, one in the area of Old Testament, myself, and then Peter Gurry in the area of New Testament, whom you're going to hear from in a little bit. And when we both realized that we were kind of uniquely positioned to start an institute that could organize and focus efforts on researching the history of the Bible, the reliability of the Bible, the history of the canon. That's a whole nother question, right? How do we have the books? How do various groups in Judaism and Christianity, right, have the different canons that they have? And then the whole massive area of Bible translation, and not just into English, right? But all the languages around the globe, right? The TCI, the Text and Canon Institute, kind of has an interest in all of that. And so what we're trying to do is research issues down to the bottom, okay? Studying the Bible according to its manuscripts and history and all that. But then if you go to our website at textandcanon.org, we also supply articles that are more popular in nature to help the general public appreciate appreciate the history of the Bible, and at the end of the day, come to see something new about it that they didn't know. And so we're hoping to foster biblical literacy and things like that as well. So we have again a research program where we have scholarly roundtables and publish the results of those conferences. We have a scholarship for Master of Theology students to come and study with us because they want to go off and do PhDs and things like that. And then again, we have that resource element, mainly the website at this point, where more popular level articles are put out for the public to read and again, learn something new about the history and reliability of the Bible.
Okay, thank you, Dr. John Mee. So basically, if any one of you in the audience want to study more about textual criticism, not only in Old Testament, but also in New Testament, you can check their website. And also, if you want to study under them, you can apply at Phoenix Seminary. They will lead you and they will help you about the variants in the Bible. And once again, thank you, Dr. John Mee. And I hope maybe one or two people from this audience will study at Phoenix Seminary. Okay. Okay. And then we have question from Yonghan. Please, Yonghan.
Thank you, Pak Philip. Dr. John, thanks for your presentation. It's very excellent. I don't know whether you know that in Indonesia, pronounce tetragrammaton as Yahweh is some seminary consider as a sin.
Yeah.
You should pronounce it as Adonai or Hashem. So my question is, we know that tetragrammaton for the first half we can pronounce is Yah from Hallelujah, right? But how about the other part? Which part of Hebrew Bible that makes you very confident you pronounce it as Yahweh in your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I can get into all the details on that right here and now, but yeah, Yah, right, we can be pretty confident of, as you noted, Hallelujah, right, is the short form of the tetragram. Way, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's probably the best we can do on that. But no doubt, though, it's probably a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for? A re-grammaticalized form of the name. But I will say that I'm not an expert on this, more know better, but if you go and look though at some Dead Sea Scrolls that spell it out, like Yah-O, okay, in some Qumran texts. If you look at Epiphanius and Clement of Alexandria, two very prominent church fathers, they actually give in Greek transcription the full vocalized name, Iau. Okay, and I find that interesting. Because I think it should help us see that it's not a sin to say the name. You see what I mean? There were Jews in the Second Temple period that were transcribing it according to vocalization in Greek, and there are definitely church fathers like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Epiphanius, to name a few, that were also showing that the name could be vocalized. Okay, so I don't know if they're exactly right, but I just know that we shouldn't be too afraid to pronounce the name. So that's why I continue to do so. Adonai is another Hebrew word. And of course, what happened is the Masoretes vocalized all the Yod Hey Wow Heys in the Hebrew text some 6,000 times, right? Vocalized them as according with the vocalization given to Adonai, which means master or Lord. When the Old Testament itself, though, puts a premium on the name of Yahweh, not the title Adonai. So again, we could debate this probably till the cows come home, but I just think it would be an interesting comparison, and I would like to learn more. So
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. John Mee. And then we have another question from Sean Koch, please.
I actually have three questions. The first question is actually more of a peripheral. In the beginning of the slides, you showed the Samaritan Pentateuch and dated it to 9th to 14th century AD. Is that correct? And if it is correct, I noticed that it contained probably Samaritan Hebrew or Paleo Hebrew. I do not think that in 9th to 14th century AD, these scripts are still in usage. So can you elaborate a little bit more? This is the first question. Would you want to you want me to present all the three questions before you answer?
no, I can answer that one pretty quickly. Yeah, so Samaritan Hebrew preserved that very ancient script, which looks like Paleo Hebrew. So yes, Samaritan manuscripts can be identified that way. Yeah, so it's very interesting. It's a unique feature to Samaritan Pentateuch manuscripts. But yeah, that was 9th to 14th century. So they somehow kept that scribal technique and approach alive, you see, through the entire Middle Ages.
All right. The next question would be on textual criticism of Samaritan Pentateuch. In my own research, right, I am not able to find any manuscript for us to do textual criticism. Have you come across any of them?
Well, there's a couple projects. There's an old edition of the Samaritan Pentateuch by a German named von Gall, Vongall. So that's a critical edition. You can find those for free on the internet. You should be able to download those ones for free. Then I haven't seen it yet. There's a newer edition of the Samaritan Pentateuch. Stefan Schork is one of the editors on that project. And I'm trying to remember De Gruyter, the publisher De Gruyter. They're publishing these new editions of the Samaritan Pentateuch. These apparently are better, much better than the ones by von Gall. If you want to see the manuscripts, much have been digitized these days. So Cambridge University has a digital manuscript room, and you can look up Samaritan Pentateuch manuscripts from the Cambridge University Library website, and they're amazing. They're pretty cool to look at, but they're hard to read because, as you pointed out, it's a different script altogether. So, but yeah, so the manuscripts themselves, not all of them probably, but many of them have been digitized and are freely available online.
Thank you. And for my last question, right, we move on to the New Testament era. Have you encountered any manuscript of the Hebrew New Testament?
No.
Okay, thank you.
That's not a later translation. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Sean Koch, and thank you, Dr. Mee. And now we're going to move to Bonard. Please, Bonard, if you have some questions.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, I think.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your such a great presentation, Dr. Meade. I have a question about, I might be wrong, but I'm more familiar with New Testament textual criticism. So my question here is, for me, when you elaborate about the evidence manuscript of Old Testament, for me it seems like more complicated. But when you come with that method of that Old Testament criticism, it looks like a more simple than when we come up with any kind of method of New Testament textual criticism. So for me, it's kind of like the evidence of manuscript of Testament very complicated, but the method is looks more simple. And my question is, could you please elaborate briefly any kind of method of textual criticism currently? Like in the Testament, we have CBGM, we have criticism method, something like that. But could you please elaborate briefly any kind of method of textual criticism? Thank you.
Yes, okay, very good. And yes, there are two approaches to this, isn't there? Right now, the dominant approach in Hebrew Bible textual criticism, when we create editions, we're talking about diplomatic text editions. Okay, so it's again like a text like this Job edition, right, of the BHQ, right? And when I open this, it's just the Codex Leningrad printed up top here, and then scholarly apparatus down below, right, noting the variants to the Codex Leningrad. So a diplomatic text edition is taking the text of one single manuscript, a very good manuscript, and then noting, right, variants to it. Okay. I think that's Bonar, I think that's what you mean that by it being simple in some ways. Because and that's fine. That's a fair, I think a fair evaluation. Contrast that with the New Testament, right? Something like the CBGM, which Dr. Gurry will tell you more about, more than you want to know about. Okay, when it comes to that, but they're right. They're creating these so-called scientific or eclectic texts, right? That really aren't to be identified in any single manuscript, right? But we're using all the manuscripts in Greek to get back to, right, that original text, right, or arc text. Okay, and the Hebrew Bible world is not quite there yet. But what I will say, there's a critical text project on the Psalter that's underway right now. Drew Longacre and Brent Strawn at Duke University just received an NEH grant here in the States, and they are currently working on a critical Hebrew text of Psalms 1 to 50, okay, for what's known as the SBL Hebrew Text Project. And so this is a diplomatic text edition. That SBL text project is going to be an eclectic text, okay, for the Hebrew Bible. And they are trying to use some of those digital techniques, okay, for collating and for making textual choices and that sort of thing. So great question. Great question.
Okay, thank you, Bonar, and thank you, Dr. Johnny. And we have a question from Dr. Stefanus Karnadi. Bapak Stefanus, are you still here? Okay. Okay, maybe I will just read his questions on the column chat. Okay, Dr. Stefanus says that I heard that the Masoretes have their own political agenda, even in preserving the text, especially pertaining to Jesus as Messiah. Is it true? Do you have any example of this? Yeah, something like that.
It's a good question. I don't know. I'm not convinced, but Dr. Chia, you might know. I mean, I don't know. I go back there. I'm gonna be honest. There's maybe a handful, a few cases in my mind where it's possible to think the Masoretes changed a text to avoid Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, but it's very subtle. Some of it has to do with the accent marks in Daniel 9, for example, that can change when the 69th and a half week is supposed to appear. Okay, and whether that appears in the time of Jesus or earlier. Okay, so there's little things like that some speculate about. There's one that I don't think it's an intentional change on the scribe's part. There's in Psalm 22, verse 16. Most of our Bibles follow the Septuagint, that line where it says they pierced, where the Messiah is saying in Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet. Okay. And the Masoretic text can't be read as they pierced. The Masoretic text reads, like a lion at my hands and my feet. Okay. And it's the difference of one letter, a yod or a wow at the end of the word. Okay. And I just think what happens is the text probably read as a verb originally. That's what the Septuagint of Psalm 22:16 teaches us. They pierced my hands and my feet. But in the textual transmission, by the time that text gets to the Masoretes, they're no longer reading a verb there. They're reading the noun for lion. Okay. And they have a text which doesn't make great sense altogether, but it makes enough sense that they simply point it as like a lion. And some commentators over the years have said the Masoretes intentionally changed that text. And I don't think we have to conclude that. I can see why they say that. But I do think there was a corruption, a very minor one, that just made a big difference in meaning, okay, between the Hebrew text of the Greek Psalms translator and the text of the later Masoretic text, you see. So some have said, well, they're just trying to avoid the obvious conclusion that Jesus's hands were pierced and his feet were pierced. But I don't think that's quite right. But again, we could talk more about that probably. It's a good example, but I don't know. Dr. Chia, can you think of any more off the top of your head? Those are the big ones that I can think of. I don't know. There's more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Meade. Okay, now we have question from Dr. Jin, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Dr. Meade, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you as well for bringing up the discussion about 4Q Deuteronomy and of Dead Sea Scrolls, as we know that it is very different than other ancient texts. So my question is about the elaboration of 4Q Deuteronomy N. If we read it here, there are also not only just differences in the text, but also also in the wordings of the quotation and the wording of verse 15. We read it here in the 4Q Deuteronomy N. Alken tiwaka Adonai Elohecha lishmor et yom hashabat. So the word lishmor in the Dead Sea Scroll is actually in the Masoretic text la'asot. So there is a difference between theological understanding of the Dead Sea Scroll and the word of the Dead Sea Scroll. And also the last quotation from, as you said, that it was taken from Exodus 20:11. The last word lekacho in the Dead Sea Scroll is also different with Exodus 20:11.
Yes, that's right.
So my
That's
question is, do you think that the 4Q Deuteronomy and elaborated the text not only for liturgical, as you said before, liturgical purpose, but also theological clarification of the Proto-Masoretic text? Thank you.
Yes. Right. So that's why I leave it open. Is it liturgical only? Maybe. Or is this a primitive form of commentary or interpretational texts, right? So that's what I'm getting at. No doubt those are intentional changes, but I think again that goes to the point that the scribe is employing the resumptive repetition, right? He has to use the same term, lakadsho, right, around the beginning and the ending of the edition. And so that's what brackets to let the reader and user of the manuscript know this is an addition from earlier in the book. Okay. So he does have to be free in his copying in order to do that. No question. The other issue is what I've noticed is in 4Q Deuteronomy N, again, there are other harmonizations. I don't take the time in this presentation to walk through all of the different harmonizations in 4Q Deuteronomy N, but many of them seem to flow to other parts of the text. So again, like again, using shamor to keep, right, versus zakor to remember, right? There are different verbs used, but again, I think overall this fits that scribe's MO, right? His mode of operation, in that he's trying to bring some conformity to this. There's more of a Deuteronomy flavor to this versus the language from Exodus. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jen, and also like Dr. Meade. And since we have a few Sunday school teachers in the audience, so when you brought up about the height of Goliath, they confused. What should we teach to our kids? So like
Yeah,
maybe,
that's right.
so maybe can you help them?
Yeah, I can
Yeah,
try.
yeah, maybe can you help them? Like, okay, so in your opinion, in your research, so what is the height of Goliath?
Yeah,
6 cubit
yeah,
or 4 cubit?
yeah.
Thank you.
I know. I wish I had stronger conviction on this. I think I'm probably I think I'm still on board with the taller Goliath. Okay, the 6 cubits and a span. So most of our kids' Sunday school curriculum, right? We always present him as this really tall giant. And so I like to say though, if for some reason we became convinced of the shorter Goliath, right, much of our children's Sunday school curriculum would have to change, wouldn't it? Because he would not be head and shoulders over everybody. He would be closer in height to Saul himself. So I think I still think there's great evidence for the taller Goliath. So that's where I'm at, and I that's the way I still teach it today. But there's, like I said, this one's a tough one, and but obviously with children, I usually just err on one side. I just say he's very, very tall. So good question.
Thank you, Dr. John Mee. And once again, we are so thankful and we are honored that Dr. John Mee gave his time for us to equip us and then to open our knowledge about textual criticism, especially for Old Testament. And thank you. And now we have like a small appreciation, like certificate of appreciation. Yes. And we're gonna send it to you, Dr. John Mee.
Oh,
Yes, once again,
oh, thank you.
you. Yes, thank you once again for your participation. Thank you for your lecture, and thank you for your time. We cannot, yeah. Once again, it is an honor for us. It is a blessing, and we have audience not only from Indonesia, but also we have audience from Malaysia as well. Once again, thank you. Thank you for being a blessing for many nations, especially in Asia. Once again, it is an honor for us. Okay.
Well, thank you all. It was my pleasure. So
Okay, thank you. And then I will return to Dr. Sri Mulyani.